I had spent 3 years meticulously plotting her professional downfall, yet as the sudden blast of freezing wind knocked out the last of our power, she was the only thing keeping me from completely falling apart. If you are ready for a story where sparks fly in the freezing cold and hatred slowly turns into something else entirely, make sure to hit that subscribe button, leave a massive like on this video, and tell me in the comments what you think will happen next. Part 1: The Aspen Trap. I hated Chloe Bennett. It wasn't a casual, passing annoyance, nor was it the kind of mild distaste you feel for a coworker who talks too loudly on the phone. No, my hatred for Chloe was a living, breathing entity. It was an art form. For 3 years at Vanguard Media, we had been locked in a bloodthirsty war for the same promotions, the same clients, and the same corner office. I was the one who arrived at the office at 6 in the morning, my hair pulled back into a severe bun, armed with meticulously color-coded spreadsheets and a ruthless dedication to my career. Chloe, on the other hand, was chaos personified. She would waltz in at 9:15, her golden brown hair falling in effortless, perfect waves, holding an iced matcha latte and charming the absolute life out of everyone she met. Where I won clients through undeniable logic and relentless data, Chloe won them over with a brilliant, infuriating charisma and a devastatingly bright smile that never quite reached her piercing green eyes when she looked at me. We were both 28, both fiercely ambitious, and both completely unwilling to lose. Which is exactly why our CEO, Richard, had finally lost his mind and forced us into this nightmare. "You are my two top executives," Richard had said, sitting behind his massive oak desk just 2 days ago. "But your constant bickering is tearing the creative team apart. There is a vacant VP position. Neither of you is getting it unless you can prove you can synergize. I've rented the company's luxury cabin in Aspen for the weekend. You two are going to go up there completely isolated and you are going to draft the Miller campaign together. If you don't come back with a unified pitch by Monday morning, I'm giving the promotion to the Seattle branch. Do I make myself clear?" And so that was how I found myself gripping the steering wheel of my SUV so hard my knuckles were white, navigating the treacherous, winding mountain roads of Colorado with my mortal enemy sitting in the passenger seat. The silence in the car was suffocating. I kept my eyes glued to the snow-covered asphalt, the tires crunching loudly in the eerie quiet of the mountain pass. The heater was blasting, but I could still feel the icy chill radiating from the passenger side. "You're taking this turn too fast, Emma," Chloe drawled, breaking the hour-long silence. Her voice was infuriatingly calm, laced with that signature hint of amusement that always made my blood boil. "I am driving the exact speed limit, Chloe," I snapped back, not daring to look at her. "Unlike you, I actually pay attention to the rules." "Rules are just suggestions for people who lack imagination," she replied smoothly. I could see her out of the corner of my eye, casually resting her head against the window, watching the dense pine trees blur past. She was wearing a thick, oversized cream-colored sweater that somehow made her look like she had just stepped out of a winter catalog. "But by all means, keep gripping that steering wheel like you're trying to choke it to death. It's a great look for you. Very relaxed. If you have a problem with my driving, you are more than welcome to get out and walk the remaining 12 miles up this mountain," I fired back, finally shooting her a glare. Chloe just laughed. It was a soft, throaty sound that I hated more than anything in the world. "And leave you all alone in the big, scary woods? Never, Em. Who would you have to glare at?" "Don't call me Em." "Whatever you say, Emma." We arrived at the cabin just as the late afternoon sun was beginning to dip below the jagged peaks of the mountains. The sky was an angry, bruised purple, heavy with dark clouds that looked incredibly ominous. The cabin itself was undeniably gorgeous, a massive A-frame structure built of dark wood and stone, featuring giant floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over a sprawling, desolate valley. It was beautiful, yes, but right now it felt more like a beautifully constructed prison. I parked the car in the gravel driveway, instantly cutting the engine. Before I could even unbuckle my seatbelt, the biting cold was already seeping through the glass. We both grabbed our duffel bags and the heavy boxes of files from the trunk in absolute silence, eager to just get inside and claim our respective territories. The interior of the cabin was sprawling and luxurious, smelling of pine and expensive leather. There was a massive stone fireplace in the center of the living room, a sprawling velvet sectional sofa, and a state-of-the-art kitchen. "I'll take the master bedroom," we both said at the exact same time. I stopped dead in my tracks, dropping my duffel bag onto the hardwood floor with a heavy thud. "Excuse me." I turned to face her, my eyes narrowing. "I drove the entire way up here. I navigated the mountain. I get the master bedroom." Chloe crossed her arms over her chest, a challenging smirk playing on her lips. "And I provided the playlist that kept you from falling asleep at the wheel. Furthermore, I'm taller than you. I need the bigger bed. You are taller than me by exactly 1 inch." I practically yelled, my frustration finally bubbling over. "I swear to God, Chloe, if you don't back down on this." "Or what?" she interrupted, taking a step closer to me. The playful smirk vanished from her face, replaced by a sudden intense sharpness. Her green eyes locked onto mine, and for a second the sheer force of her presence made my breath hitch. "You'll write a strongly worded email about me? You'll reorganize my desk? I'll make sure you regret ever stepping foot in this cabin," I whispered, my voice dangerously low. We were standing mere inches apart now. I could smell her perfume, something warm and intoxicating like vanilla and amber. It made me incredibly angry that she smelled so good. "I already regret it," she murmured, her gaze dropping to my lips for a fraction of a second before snapping back up to my eyes. "Fine. Take the damn master bedroom. I'll take the guest room downstairs. The farther away from you, the better." "Agreed," I said, my heart hammering against my ribs for reasons I absolutely refused to analyze. We retreated to our separate corners of the cabin, the tension between us thick enough to cut with a knife. For the next 3 hours, we sat at opposite ends of the massive oak dining table, our laptops open, creating a physical barrier between us. We didn't speak. The only sounds in the cabin were the frantic clicking of our keyboards and the increasingly aggressive howling of the wind outside. I glanced up from my screen, rubbing my tired eyes. Beside the giant glass windows, the world had completely disappeared. The bruised purple sky had been swallowed by a violent, swirling mass of white. The snow wasn't just falling, it was being driven sideways by gale-force winds, slamming against the glass with terrifying force. Trees at the edge of the property were bending wildly, groaning under the pressure. "Have you checked the weather app?" Chloe asked suddenly. Her voice lacked its usual arrogant edge. Sounded tight. "No," I replied, grabbing my phone. I swiped the screen, but nothing happened. "I don't have any signal." "Do you?" Chloe held up her phone, shaking her head. 0 bars. And the Wi-Fi just dropped out. I felt a sudden cold knot form in my stomach. I stood up and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, pressing my hand against the freezing glass. Temperature in the room was definitely dropping. "It's just a snowstorm," I said, trying to sound much more confident than I actually felt. "It's Aspen in December. This is normal. We have enough food and the heating is working fine. We just need to focus on the Miller pitch." "Emma," Chloe said quietly. I turned around. She was staring at the lights above the kitchen island. They were flickering. "Don't be dramatic," I scoffed, though my own heart was starting to race. "It's just a power surge from the wind. It's a luxury cabin, Chloe. They definitely have backup generators." "We are totally..." A deafening crack echoed from outside, sounding like a gunshot, followed by the terrifying sound of a massive tree splintering and crashing to the ground nearby. And then, plunged into absolute suffocating darkness, the cabin went completely silent. The hum of the refrigerator, the whir of the central heating, the soft glow of the lamps, everything died in an instant. The darkness was absolute, save for the faint, ghostly white light reflecting off the blizzard outside. "Emma!" Chloe's voice cut through the pitch black, and for the first time in 3 years, she didn't sound arrogant or smug or infuriatingly confident. She sounded genuinely scared. "I'm here," I whispered back, my voice trembling. The bitter rivalry that had consumed my life for 36 months suddenly felt incredibly insignificant as the reality of our situation washed over me. We were completely isolated, miles away from civilization, trapped in a blizzard with no power, no cell service, and no heat. And the temperature inside the cabin was already beginning to plummet. End of Part 1. Part 2, Into the Dark. The darkness in the cabin wasn't just an absence of light. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket that seemed to press the freezing air directly against my skin. For a few agonizing seconds, neither of us moved. The only sound was the deafening roar of the blizzard violently battering the glass of the floor-to-ceiling windows, threatening to shatter them at any moment. "Chloe," I called out again, my voice sounding incredibly small in the cavernous space. "Don't move," she replied instantly. Her voice was coming from my left, trembling slightly. Suddenly, a harsh, blinding beam of white light pierced the blackness. Chloe had managed to turn on the flashlight on her phone. The beam swept erratically across the room, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the sudden chill before finally landing on my face. I squinted, raising a hand to shield my eyes. "Turn it down, you're blinding me," I muttered, my defensive instincts automatically kicking in despite the terror clawing at my chest. The light dipped, pointing at the floor between us. In the dim spill of the LED glow, I could see Chloe's face. The usual mask of effortless confidence had completely vanished. She looked pale, her green eyes wide and darting toward the massive windows. For a fleeting second, the fierce, untouchable Chloe Bennett looked incredibly fragile, and a strange, protective instinct flared in my chest, an instinct I violently squashed down. "The generator should have kicked in immediately," she said, her breath already beginning to form a faint white mist in the freezing air. "Why didn't the generator kick in?" "I don't know," I said, forcing myself to adopt the calm, authoritative tone I used in boardrooms. "Panic wouldn't save us. Logic would. Keep your lights steady. Let's find the utility closet. Maybe it's just a tripped breaker from the power surge." We moved together slowly, instinctively staying close. The spacious luxury of the cabin suddenly felt like a labyrinth of dangerous shadows. Our footsteps echoed loudly against the hardwood floor. I pulled out my own phone, turning on the flashlight to double our visibility. "The breaker box is usually near the back entrance or the basement," I instructed, leading the way toward the rear of the massive A-frame structure. The temperature was dropping with terrifying speed. Without the massive central heating system fighting off the mountain winter, the cabin was rapidly turning into an icebox. I shivered, pulling my thin cardigan tighter around my shoulders. I hadn't dressed for a survival situation, I had dressed for a corporate retreat. "Are you cold?" Chloe asked from right behind me. She was so close I could feel the faint warmth radiating from her body. "I'm fine," I lied through my teeth already beginning to chatter. We found the utility closet tucked away behind the kitchen pantry. I pulled open the heavy metal door and shined my light inside. The breaker box was there, its metal surface cold to the touch. I popped the latch and scanned the rows of switches. None of them were tripped. They were all perfectly in line. "It's not the breaker," I muttered, a heavy stone of dread dropping in my stomach. "Then the generator is broken," Chloe concluded softly, leaning over my shoulder to look. Her shoulder brushed against mine, sending an involuntary shockwave down my spine. I stiffened, acutely aware of the contact, but I didn't pull away. I swallowed hard, remembering the terrifying crack we had heard right before the lights went out. Or that tree we heard falling took out the generator entirely. Silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. The implication hung in the air like an executioner's blade. We were trapped in the middle of the Colorado mountains, miles from the nearest town, with roads buried under feet of snow, no cell service, and absolutely no way to heat the massive cabin. "Okay," Chloe breathed out, stepping back and running a hand through her perfectly styled hair, messing it up in a way that was distractingly attractive. "Okay, Emma. You're the one with the color-coded spreadsheets and the backup plans for your backup plans. What's the protocol for this? Because freezing to death wasn't on my itinerary for the weekend. I turned to face her. The sarcastic edge was back in her voice, but I could see the genuine fear tight around the corners of her eyes. She was looking to me for answers. Chloe Bennett, the woman who had spent 3 years trying to prove she was better than me at everything, was waiting for me to take the lead. First, I said, my mind racing as survival instincts overpowered my corporate anxiety, we need to secure a heat source. This cabin has a massive stone fireplace in the living room. We need to see if there's dry wood inside. If we don't get a fire going in the next 20 minutes, the ambient temperature in here is going to drop below freezing. Right. Wood. Fire. I can do that, Chloe nodded, her jaw setting in determination. Second, I continued, pacing slightly in the small hallway, we need to gather every single blanket, pillow, and heavy piece of fabric in this cabin. We need to create a smaller, insulated space near the fire. Heating this entire open-plan cabin is impossible. We need to build a nest, essentially. A nest, Chloe repeated, a faint, almost hysterical chuckle escaping her lips. I'm going to build a nest with my mortal enemy. Unless you prefer to freeze to death out of spite, I snapped, though there was no real venom in it. No, come on. We split up, though neither of us strayed far from the other's flashlight beam. Chloe headed straight for the living room, dropping to her knees in front of the massive hearth. I watched her for a brief second, the way her thick cream sweater bunched around her waist, before I shook my head and sprinted toward the bedrooms. I raided the master suite first, violently stripping the heavy down comforter, the thick woolen throws, and every pillow off the massive king-sized bed. I piled them into my arms until I could barely see over the top of them and hurried back to the living room. I dumped the pile onto the expensive Persian rug right in front of the fireplace and ran to the guest bedroom downstairs to do the same. By the time I returned with the second load, my fingers and toes were completely numb, and my breath was a constant cloud of white smoke. Chloe was sitting cross-legged on the hearth, furiously working with a long match and a pile of kindling. Good news and bad news, she said, not looking up as she struck another match. It flared, casting deep, dancing shadows across her sharp cheekbones. Good news is, the cleaners left a massive stack of seasoned oak right here in the copper bin. There's enough to last us until tomorrow afternoon, maybe longer if we ration it. And the bad news? I asked, dropping the second mountain of blankets onto the floor and kneeling down beside her. I rubbed my freezing hands together, desperate for friction. The bad news is that I am a city girl who pays a guy to light the fire in my apartment, she grumbled in frustration as the match hissed and died in the cold air. I can't get the damn draft to catch the kindling. It just keeps smoking and dying. Move over, I ordered softly. To my surprise, she didn't argue. She shifted to the side, her knee bumping against my thigh as I took her place in front of the cold, dark hearth. I grabbed a piece of crumpled newspaper from the bottom of the bin and carefully arranged it under the smallest, driest twigs I could find, building a tiny teepee structure. Where did you learn to do that? Chloe asked quietly. The aggressive howling of the storm outside seemed to fade into the background as she leaned closer to watch me. I could feel her eyes tracking my every movement. My dad, I murmured, my voice softer than I intended. He used to take me camping in the Adirondacks every winter when I was a kid. He was obsessed with survival skills. Said you never knew when the world was going to end. I let out a dry, humorless laugh. I used to hate it. I just wanted to stay home and read. But right now, I think I owe him a massive apology. I struck a match against the stone and carefully cupped the flame, bringing it to the edge of the newspaper. Paper caught instantly, a bright, hungry line of orange eating its way up into the kindling. I leaned in, blowing gently on the embers, feeding them oxygen until the small twigs began to crackle and pop. Carefully, methodically, I added slightly larger pieces of wood until a steady, beautiful, roaring fire was established in the grate. A wave of intense, glorious heat immediately washed over my frozen face. I closed my eyes, letting out a long, shaky sigh of relief. "Show off," Chloe whispered. I opened my eyes and turned my head. She was still sitting right next to me, her face glowing in the golden light of the flames. We were so close that our knees were pressed firmly together. I could see the tiny golden flecks in her green eyes, and the way her lips were slightly parted. The animosity, the rivalry, the 3 years of bitter office warfare, it all felt a million miles away, buried under the snow outside. Right here, in the small circle of light and heat we had just created, it was just the two of us. For a long, suspended moment, neither of us moved away. The air between us was thick with something I couldn't name, something electric and terrifyingly warm. My heart pounded a frantic rhythm against my ribs, and I wasn't entirely sure it was from the cold anymore. "We should." I started, my voice breaking slightly. I cleared my throat, forcing myself to look away from her mouth. "We should set up the blankets before the heat escapes up the vaulted ceiling." "Right. The blankets," Chloe agreed, her voice equally breathless. She finally pulled back, breaking the spell, and began dragging the massive down comforters off the pile I had created. We worked together in a strange, synchronized silence, dragging the heavy velvet sectional sofa closer to the fire to act as a barricade against the creeping cold from the rest of the room. We layered the thick rugs, the comforters, and the woolen throws between the sofa and the hearth, creating a dense, heavily insulated cocoon of fabric. By the time we finished, the fire was blazing, casting long, dancing shadows across the high wooden ceiling of the cabin. But outside the small perimeter of our makeshift nest, the air was dangerously frigid. I sat down on the edge of the blanket pile, pulling my knees to my chest and wrapping my arms around my legs. I was still shivering uncontrollably, the chill having seeped deep into my bones during our frantic search. Chloe stood by the sofa, looking down at me. She was holding the thickest, heaviest down comforter we had found in the master bedroom. She looked at the blanket, then looked at me, her expression unreadable in the firelight. "Emma," she said quietly, her voice devoid of any mockery. "You're freezing." "I'm fine," I lied again, my teeth audibly clicking together. Chloe let out a heavy sigh, rolling her eyes. But it wasn't a mean gesture, it was almost fond. "You are the most stubborn, infuriating woman I have ever met in my entire life." Before I could formulate a witty comeback to defend my honor, Chloe stepped into the makeshift nest. She didn't sit on the opposite side, as the rules of our rivalry dictated. Instead, she dropped down right beside me, so close that the entire right side of my body was pressed against the entire left side of hers. My breath hitched. "What are you doing?" I choked out. "Survival skills, Emma," Chloe murmured, her voice smooth and dangerously low as she threw the massive down comforter over both of us, plunging us into a shared, intimate darkness beneath the heavy fabric. "Body heat is the most efficient way to raise your core temperature." Underneath the heavy blanket, surrounded by the smell of vanilla, amber, and wood smoke, the absolute last thing on my mind was the Vanguard media promotion. End of Part 2. Part 3, the ice breaks. The space beneath the massive down comforter was a universe entirely its own. Beside our makeshift fabric fortress, the Aspen blizzard raged with apocalyptic fury, the wind shrieking against the glass and the brutal cold threatening to claim the cabin. But beneath the heavy layers of velvet and down, there was only the suffocating, intoxicating reality of Chloe Bennett. She was pressed against me from shoulder to knee. I could feel the rhythmic rise and fall of her chest, the soft wool of her oversized sweater against my arm, and the undeniable radiating heat of her body. For 3 years, the only physical contact we had ever shared consisted of aggressive handshakes in front of clients or accidentally brushing shoulders while fighting for the espresso machine in the break room. Now, in the pitch black beneath the blanket, with the faint orange glow of the fire bleeding through the edges of the fabric, we were tangled together like survivors clinging to a lifeboat. I held my breath, terrified that if I inhaled too deeply, I would somehow shatter the fragile truce we had just established. My heart was thumping a frantic, deafening beat against my ribs. I was absolutely certain she could hear it. You're as stiff as a board, Emma, Chloe whispered. Her voice was incredibly close, the sound vibrating in the small pocket of air between us. Relax. I promise I'm not going to bite you. Unless, of course, we run out of food. Then all bets are off. I let out a shaky breath that was half laugh, half gasp. If you try to eat me, I will absolutely haunt you for the rest of your natural life. I would expect nothing less, she murmured, shifting slightly. The movement caused her leg to slide flush against mine. A jolt of electricity shot straight up my spine, completely bypassing my brain and sending a flush of heat to my cheeks. I squeezed my eyes shut, mentally reciting Vanguard Media's quarterly projections in a desperate attempt to ground myself. Q1 profits were up by 12%. The Miller account requires a multifaceted digital approach. Chloe Bennett smells like vanilla and expensive mistakes. Better, she asked softly, apparently feeling some of the tension leave my shoulders. Warmer, I admitted, my voice barely more than a raspy whisper. It was the truth. The agonizing bone-deep chill that had gripped me since the power went out was finally beginning to retreat, replaced by a slow, creeping warmth that felt dangerously comforting. See? Sometimes my rule-breaking, chaotic methods actually work, Chloe said, a hint of her usual smugness returning. This isn't a method, Chloe. It's basic thermodynamics, I countered instinctively, unable to let her have the last word. It was a reflex, a deeply ingrained habit forged in the fires of corporate warfare. To my surprise, she didn't fire back with a sarcastic retort. Instead, she laughed, a quiet, genuine sound that I had never actually heard directed at me. It wasn't the sharp, performative laugh she used to charm executives. It was softer, unguarded, and it made my chest ache in a way that defied all logic. God, you are so incredibly stubborn, Chloe breathed out, her head turning slightly on the pillow we were sharing. I could feel the ghost of her breath against my cheek. Even now, stranded in the middle of nowhere, freezing to death, you still have to correct me. It's what I do, I replied, swallowing hard. I fix things. I bring order to chaos. Is that how you see me? She asked. Playful edge had vanished from her tone, replaced by something heavier, something that felt dangerously close to vulnerability. As chaos. I hesitated. In the safety of the dark, stripped of our tailored suits and our perfectly rehearsed pitches, the lines that divided us were beginning to blur. You walk into a room and completely upend it, Chloe. You don't follow schedules. You ignore protocol. You charm people instead of giving them hard data. You drive me absolutely insane. Silence stretched between us, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire outside our cocoon. I instantly regretted my words. I had ruined it. I had brought the toxicity of the office into the one safe space we had managed to build. I do it on purpose, you know, she said quietly, her voice so low I had to strain to hear it over the storm. Do what on purpose? Push your buttons. I turned my head toward her. Even in the dim, filtered light, I could see the outline of her profile, the sharp curve of her jaw, and the dark silhouette of her eyelashes. Why? I asked, genuine confusion lacing my words. Why go out of your way to make my life miserable? Chloe let out a long, slow exhale. She shifted again, and this time she turned her body fully toward me. We were face to face, mere inches apart. I could feel the ambient heat radiating from her, wrapping around me like a physical embrace. Because, Emma, you are the only person in that entire building who doesn't just hand me what I want, she confessed, her words hitting me like a physical blow. Everyone else at Vanguard just falls over themselves to agree with me. They nod, they smile, they laugh at my jokes. But you? You look at me like I have two heads. You challenge every single idea I bring to the table. You force me to be sharper, faster, better. I stared at her, completely paralyzed. Chloe Bennett, I knew, the arrogant, effortless golden girl, was peeling away, revealing someone entirely different underneath. I didn't steal the Harrison account from you last year because I wanted the bonus, she continued, her voice trembling slightly. I took it because I knew it would make you furious. I knew you would storm into my office, slam your heavily researched folders on my desk, and fight me for it. It was the only time I actually felt awake in that soul-crushing corporate wasteland. My brain struggled to process the information. 3 years of resentment, of late nights plotting her professional demise, of secretly crying in the bathroom stalls out of sheer frustration, all of it reframed in an instant. She wasn't trying to destroy me. She was trying to engage with me. That is the most twisted, deeply psychotic compliment I have ever received, I managed to whisper, my heart hammering wildly in my throat. Chloe let out a soft, breathy chuckle, closing the tiny distance between us until our foreheads were almost touching. I'm a complex woman, Em. Don't call me Em, I murmured, but there was absolutely no bite to it this time. I'll call you whatever I want, she replied, her voice dropping an octave, sending a fresh, terrifying shiver down my spine. Suddenly, the fire outside our blanket fort gave a loud, aggressive pop, and a distinct drop in temperature washed over our exposed faces. The thick oak logs were burning down to embers. If we didn't add more wood soon, the fragile ecosystem we had created would collapse, and the mountain cold would reclaim the room. The fire is dying, I whispered, though neither of us made a move to leave the warmth of the blankets. I know, Chloe replied, her eyes locked onto mine in the shadows. Someone has to go out there and put another log on. I know. It should probably be you, I suggested, a faint smile playing on my lips. Since I built the fire in the first place. Division of labor. Absolutely not, Chloe countered, though she was smiling too. I am the designated heat source. If I leave, you'll freeze. Too dangerous. You have to go. I am the architect of this blanket fort. The architect never does manual labor. We were whispering, our faces so close that we were sharing the same air. The banter felt familiar, comfortable, but the venom that usually laced our words was entirely gone. It was replaced by an electric, magnetic pull that was dragging me closer to her with every passing second. With a dramatic sigh, Chloe finally pulled back, breaking the spell. Fine. I will brave the frozen tundra. But if I don't make it back, tell Richard that his Aspen retreat was a terrible idea. She threw back her side of the heavy down comforter, instantly letting in a blast of frigid air that made me gasp. In a flash of movement, she scrambled out of the nest and knelt before the hearth. I watched her from the safety of the blankets, admiring the graceful curve of her back as she grabbed 2 large logs from the copper bin and carefully placed them onto the glowing embers. Sparks flew up into the chimney, illuminating her face in flashes of bright orange and gold. She poked at the logs with the iron poker until the flames caught again, roaring back to life and pushing the encroaching shadows back to the edges of the room. Shivering violently, she dropped the poker and dove back under the blankets with me. God, it's freezing out there, she gasped, her teeth chattering loudly as she scrambled to pull the heavy fabric back over our heads. Without thinking, driven purely by instinct and the overwhelming desire to stop her from shivering, I reached out. I grabbed the lapels of her thick sweater and pulled her firmly against me. Chloe gasped, her eyes flying wide in the dark as her chest collided with mine. My arms wrapped around her waist, locking her securely against my body. For a second, she was completely rigid, shocked by my sudden aggressive movement. I squeezed my eyes shut, silently cursing myself for crossing a line I couldn't uncross. But then, with a soft, defeated sigh, Chloe completely melted into my embrace. Her arms snaked around my shoulders, pulling me impossibly closer. She buried her freezing face into the crook of my neck, her nose pressing against my collarbone. The contrast of her cold skin against my flushed neck made me gasp, but I held on tighter, tangling one of my hands into the soft, golden-brown waves of her hair at the nape of her neck. Is this okay? I whispered into the darkness, my voice shaking with an emotion I was entirely unprepared to handle. Chloe didn't answer immediately. Instead, she shifted her weight, throwing one of her legs over mine, effectively pinning us together in a full-body embrace. The heat between us magnified instantly, creating a dizzying, overwhelming cocoon of warmth and the scent of vanilla. She turned her head slightly, her lips grazing the sensitive skin right just beneath my ear. Touch was so light it might have been a ghost, but it sent a shockwave of absolute fire straight through my veins. "I don't hate you, Emma," she whispered into the dark, her breath hot against my skin. "I don't think I ever did." I closed my eyes, a single tear escaping and sliding down my cheek, lost in the shadows. The wind howled against the glass, tearing at the cabin with merciless force, but inside, wrapped in the arms of my worst enemy, I had never felt safer in my entire life. End of Part 3. Part 4, The Space Between Us. The words hung in the tiny, insulated space beneath the heavy-down comforter, echoing in the deafening silence that followed. "I don't hate you, Emma. I don't think I ever did." For 3 years, I had built my entire professional identity around the absolute certainty that Chloe Bennet was my nemesis. I had weaponized my ambition against her, using her effortless grace and undeniable charisma as the fuel to power my own relentless drive. I had convinced myself that every lingering look she gave me across the conference room table was a challenge, every smirk a calculated insult, and every victory she claimed a direct attack on my worth. But right now, with her freezing hands tucked against my ribs and her face buried in the curve of my neck, the grand illusion of our rivalry was shattering into a million irreparable pieces. My voice cracked, betraying the hurricane of emotions swirling in my chest. I swallowed hard, trying to find the words, but my notoriously sharp vocabulary had completely abandoned me. "I don't hate you either." It was a terrifying admission. Saying it out loud felt like surrendering my strongest armor, leaving me completely exposed in the dark. Chloe's grip on me tightened. She let out a long, shuddering exhale that ghosted across my collarbone, sending a fresh wave of heat pooling in my stomach. She didn't say anything else, and she didn't pull away. Instead, she shifted her weight, settling even deeper into the embrace. The heavy wool of her oversized cream sweater was scratchy against my thin cardigan, but beneath the layers of winter clothing, I could feel the frantic, heavy beating of her heart. It was racing just as fast as mine. Time lost all meaning inside our makeshift velvet and down fortress. Side, the Aspen blizzard continued its merciless assault on the luxury cabin. The wind shrieked like a wounded animal, rattling the massive floor-to-ceiling windows and threatening to tear the roof from its heavy wooden beams. But inside, anchored by the radiant heat of the roaring fire just inches from our barricade and the overpowering warmth of Chloe's body wrapped around mine, the storm felt like it belonged to another planet. Slowly, agonizingly so, the frantic adrenaline of our survival situation began to ebb, replaced by a heavy, intoxicating exhaustion. My muscles, which had been coiled tight with freezing tension and corporate anxiety for the past 12 hours, finally began to melt. I didn't mean to fall asleep. In fact, I had strictly ordered myself to stay awake, to monitor the fire and ensure the ambient temperature in our cocoon didn't drop. But the hypnotic rhythm of Chloe's breathing, the soothing scent of vanilla and amber that clung to her hair, and the overwhelming, undeniable comfort of being held by her dragged me under. When I finally woke, the pitch-black darkness of the cabin had shifted to a deep, bruised indigo. The fire had died down significantly, reduced to a bed of glowing, pulsating orange embers that cast a faint, ethereal light through the gaps in our blanket fort. I blinked heavily, my brain taking a few seconds to process my surroundings. I was incredibly warm. In fact, I was almost too warm. I tried to shift my legs, but something heavy was pinning them down. I looked down, my eyes adjusting to the dim, fiery glow. Chloe was fast asleep, completely draped over me. At some point during the night, we had shifted from our side-by-side embrace into something profoundly more intimate. She was lying half on top of me, one of her long legs thrown securely over my hips. Her head rested heavily on my chest, her face turned toward the faint light of the embers. One of her arms was slung across my waist, her fingers curled loosely into the fabric of my cardigan. I froze, completely terrified to breathe lest I wake her. In the soft, forgiving light of the dying fire, stripped of her sharp corporate suits and her carefully applied makeup, she looked breathtakingly beautiful. The aggressive, untouchable aura of the Vanguard media executive was completely gone. In its place was just a woman, soft, vulnerable, and deeply asleep, trusting me enough to use me as her anchor in the middle of a terrifying storm. Without thinking, my hand moved of its own accord. My fingers, which had been resting awkwardly on the heavy blanket, slowly reached out and lightly brushed a stray lock of golden brown hair away from her forehead. Her skin was incredibly soft, radiating a gentle heat that made my fingertips tingle. At my touch, Chloe stirred. She let out a soft, sleepy murmur and nuzzled her face deeper into my chest, tightening her arm around my waist. The movement sent a devastating jolt of electricity straight to my core. My breath hitched audibly in the quiet space. Her green eyes fluttered open, heavy with sleep. For a second, she looked disoriented, her brow furrowing slightly as she stared at the glowing embers. Then, she slowly tilted her head back, looking up at me. We were inches apart. The realization of our tangled limbs, the sheer proximity of our bodies, and the heavy, undeniable tension in the air crashed over us simultaneously. I expected her to pull away. I expected the defensive, sarcastic Chloe to return, to make a witty joke about boundaries or survival tactics, and to retreat to her side of the blankets. But she didn't move an inch. Instead, her gaze slowly dropped from my eyes to my lips, lingering there for a fraction of a second before snapping back up to meet my stare. The air in the tiny space suddenly felt incredibly thin. "Morning," she whispered, her voice husky and rough with sleep. It was the sexiest sound I had ever heard in my entire life, and it took every ounce of my willpower not to completely lose my mind. "It's barely morning," I managed to whisper back, my voice trembling slightly. "The sun isn't even up yet." "Are you warm enough?" she asked, her eyes searching mine, searching for something I couldn't quite name. "I'm burning up, actually," I admitted, my heart hammering a frantic, erratic rhythm against my ribs. A slow, devastatingly genuine smile spread across Chloe's face. It wasn't the smirk she used to disarm clients, and it wasn't the challenging grin she used to infuriate me in the boardroom. It was a soft, private smile meant entirely for me. "Good," she murmured, shifting slightly. As she moved, her knee brushed intimately against my thigh. I gasped quietly, my hands instinctively gripping her waist to steady myself. "Chloe." I breathed out, a warning, a question, a plea all wrapped into one fractured syllable. "Emma," she replied softly, mimicking my tone. Slowly, deliberately, she lifted her hand from my waist. Her fingers traced a feather-light path up my side, across my ribs, until her hand came to rest gently against my neck. Her thumb brushed softly across my jawline, sending a cascade of shivers down my spine that had absolutely nothing to do with the freezing temperature outside. "What are we doing?" I whispered, my logical, analytical brain fighting a losing battle against the overwhelming desire screaming through my veins. "We work together. We hate each other. Richard sent us here to fight over a promotion." "Richard is an idiot," Chloe whispered back, her thumb continuing its maddeningly slow, hypnotic stroke against my jaw. "And I don't care about the promotion. Not right now." "You always care about the promotion," I argued weakly, though I didn't pull away from her touch. In fact, I leaned into it slightly, craving the contact. "I care about winning," she corrected softly, her green eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made the room spin. "I care about besting you. But the only reason I want to best you is because you're the only one worth fighting." She shifted her weight again, rising slightly on her elbow so she was hovering directly over me. The heavy comforter slipped down her shoulders, exposing the soft curve of her neck to the cold air, but neither of us cared. Her face was so close to mine that I could feel her warm, staggered breaths brushing against my lips. "I have spent 3 years watching you, Emma," she confessed, her voice dropping to a low, magnetic whisper. "Watching the way you bite your pen when you're stressed. Watching the way your eyes narrow when you find a flaw in my pitches. watching the way you walk into a room and demand respect without ever raising your voice. It drove me insane. Because I wouldn't let you walk all over me, I reasoned, my voice barely audible over the roaring in my ears. Because I couldn't figure out how to make you look at me the way I wanted you to, she corrected, her words shattering the last remaining defenses I had. My breath caught in my throat. My hands, still resting on her waist, tightened instinctively. "And how did you want me to look at you?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mixture of terror and overwhelming anticipation. Chloe's gaze dropped to my lips again. The space between us was charged with a million unspoken words, 3 years of repressed frustration, and an undeniable burning chemistry that we could no longer ignore. "Like this," she whispered. And then she slowly began to close the final inch between us. End of Part 4. Part 5, The Point of No Return. The final inch between us vanished. When Chloe's lips finally met mine, the entire world outside our fragile fortress of blankets simply ceased to exist. For 3 years, my brain had functioned like a supercomputer, constantly processing data, analyzing variables, and predicting outcomes. But the moment she kissed me, every single logical circuit in my mind completely and violently short-circuited. There were no spreadsheets, no quarterly projections, no Vanguard media. There was only the suffocating, overwhelming reality of Chloe Bennett. Kiss started impossibly soft, a tentative, questioning exploration that felt like a secret being whispered in the dark. Her lips were incredibly warm against the lingering chill of my skin, moving against mine with agonizingly slow deliberation. I gasped softly against her mouth, a sound that was instantly swallowed by her. The tiny intake of breath was all the invitation she needed. Chloe's hand, which had been gently cupping my jaw, slid back, her long fingers tangling fiercely into the hair at the nape of my neck. The gentle hesitation completely evaporated, replaced by a sudden, desperate urgency that matched the frantic hammering of my own heart. She angled her head, deepening the kiss, and a shockwave of pure, unadulterated fire raced through my veins. Instinct completely took over. My hands, which had been resting hesitantly on her waist, gripped the thick wool of her sweater, pulling her heavy, warm body flush against mine. I kissed her back with 3 years of repressed frustration, 3 years of stolen glances across mahogany conference tables, and 3 years of convincing myself that the twisting sensation in my stomach was hatred, not an overwhelming, terrifying desire. It was messy. It was desperate. It was everything I had spent my entire adult life trying to avoid, and it was the most magnificent thing I had ever experienced. Chloe let out a soft, low groan that vibrated against my lips, shifting her weight so she was pressing me deeper into the thick down pillows beneath us. Her free hand dropped from my shoulder, tracing a scorching path down my arm until her fingers found mine, interlocking our hands tightly together in the dark. We broke apart for air, both of us panting, our chests heaving against each other in the tiny space. The heavy, insulated air beneath the comforter was thick with the scent of vanilla, wood smoke, and a heavy, undeniable electricity. I stared up at her, my vision adjusting to the faint, dying orange glow of the embers filtering through the edge of our blanket fort. Her golden brown hair was a messy halo around her face, her lips were swollen, and her piercing green eyes were dark, blown wide with an intensity that completely paralyzed me. "Emma," she breathed out, my name sounding entirely different on her lips than it ever had before. It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't a mockery. It was a plea. "You?" I swallowed hard, trying to force my brain to formulate a coherent sentence, but the analytical part of my mind had been completely obliterated. "You are completely ruining my career plan, Chloe." A wet, breathless laugh escaped her lips. She rested her forehead against mine, her nose brushing softly against my cheek. "To hell with your career plan, Emma. To hell with Vanguard. To hell with Richard and his stupid corner office." "I wanted that corner office," I whispered weakly, though the thought of it now felt incredibly distant and unimportant. "I'll buy you a desk and put it in my living room," she murmured, her lips grazing the sensitive skin of my jawline, making me shiver violently. "You can color-code your spreadsheets there. I promise I'll only ruin them a little bit." I closed my eyes, letting the sheer weight of the moment wash over me. The bitter rivalry that had defined my existence was gone, burned away in the span of a single minute. But reality, unfortunately, has a terrible habit of interrupting right when you want to ignore it most. A sharp, violent crack echoed from the fireplace, followed by a sudden, chilling draft that seeped through the heavy velvet cushions barricading us. The fire. We had been so consumed by the terrifying shift in our dynamic that we had completely ignored our only source of survival. The radiant heat that had been keeping the freezing mountain air at bay was rapidly fading. "The fire!" I breathed, reluctance heavy in my chest. Chloe sighed, a deep, frustrated sound that echoed my exact sentiments. She lifted her head, looking over her shoulder toward the faint orange glow. "It's barely embers. If we don't feed it right now, we are actually going to freeze to death." "We can't freeze to death," I said, my corporate problem-solving instincts finally managing to break through the fog of desire. "I refuse to let the Seattle branch get the Miller account because we became human popsicles." Chloe chuckled, pressing one last, firm kiss to my forehead before agonizingly peeling herself away from me. "Always thinking about the bottom line, Emma. Come on. We need to work fast." Throwing back the heavy down comforter was like jumping into a frozen lake. The ambient temperature in the cabin had plummeted dangerously low during the few hours we had been asleep. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows were entirely caked in white, blocking out the morning sun, save for a pale, eerie blue light that cast long, ghostly shadows across the hardwood floor. The storm outside had not lessened in the slightest. The wind was still howling with demonic fury. I scrambled out of the makeshift nest, my teeth instantly beginning to chatter as the freezing air cut right through my thin cardigan. Chloe was already at the copper bin, hauling out 3 massive, heavy oak logs. "Here," she commanded, passing one of the rough logs into my freezing hands. Our fingers brushed, and even in the freezing cold, the contact sent a jolt of warmth straight up my arm. "You're the architect. Tell me where to put them so we don't smother what's left." I dropped to my knees on the icy stone hearth beside her. We worked in tandem, a terrifyingly efficient team. I used the heavy iron poker to carefully gather the glowing red embers into a concentrated pile, creating a bed of intense heat. Chloe followed my silent instructions, gently laying the smallest pieces of dry kindling we had left over the embers, before we both carefully positioned the heavy oak logs on top. Within minutes, the dry wood caught. A tiny ribbon of smoke curled upward, followed by a sudden beautiful flare of bright orange flame. We both sat back on our heels, watching as the fire roared back to life, the heat instantly pushing back against the encroaching ice of the cabin. I wrapped my arms tightly around my chest, shivering uncontrollably as the adrenaline faded, leaving me painfully aware of the freezing temperature. Before I could even suggest retreating, Chloe's arm was around my shoulders. She pulled me flush against her side, her thick sweater acting as a shield against the cold. "Back in the nest, Emma. Now." Your lips are literally turning blue. We didn't argue over who got the bigger side of the blanket this time. We dove back beneath the heavy layers of velvet and down, instinctively tangling our limbs together to share body heat. I buried my freezing face into the crook of her neck, my hands finding their way beneath the hem of her sweater to rest against the warm, bare skin of her lower back. She hissed slightly at the cold contact of my fingers, but instead of pulling away, she locked her arms securely around my waist, pulling me impossibly closer. For a long time, we just lay there in the dark, listening to the crackle of the newly revived fire and the violent roar of the blizzard outside. The silence between us was no longer suffocating or tense. It was heavy with a profound, terrifying comfort. "What happens on Monday, Chloe?" I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Question had been burning a hole in my chest since the moment she kissed me. I felt her chest rise and fall in a heavy sigh. Her fingers, which had been gently stroking the fabric of my cardigan, stilled. "I don't know," she admitted honestly. "Richard expects us to come down from this mountain with a unified pitch. He expects us to fight for the VP position." "I told you I don't care about the VP position," Chloe said, her voice firm. She shifted slightly, tilting my chin up so I was forced to look into her eyes in the dim light. Emma, I only ever fought you because it was the only way you would let me close to you. You built these massive, impenetrable walls of spreadsheets, logic, and professionalism. The only way you ever looked at me was when I was tearing them down. I built them because you terrified me, I confessed, the truth slipping out before I could stop it. You walked into Vanguard 3 years ago and you were just effortless. You were brilliant and beautiful and people just naturally gravitated toward you. I had to work twice as hard just to make sure I wasn't entirely eclipsed by you. You made me feel like I wasn't enough. Chloe's expression softened into something that broke my heart a little bit. She reached up, her thumb gently wiping away a tear I hadn't even realized had escaped my eye. You are more than enough, Emma. You are the smartest, most terrifyingly capable woman I have ever met. She leaned in, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to the corner of my mouth. And if Richard thinks he can put us in a cage and make us fight each other for his amusement, he is vastly underestimating who he's dealing with. So, what's the plan? I whispered, a faint, genuine smile finally breaking across my face. Chloe grinned, a brilliant, dangerous flash of white teeth in the shadows. It was the smile she used right before she completely decimated a rival firm in a pitch meeting. But this time she was on my side. We are going to draft the most brilliant, undeniable campaign Vanguard has ever seen, she said, her voice dropping into a low, thrilling register. We are going to make it so perfect that he can't give the position to the Seattle branch. And when we walk into his office on Monday morning, we are going to demand that he makes us co-vice presidents. I stared at her, my mind racing through the sheer audacity of the plan. It was entirely against protocol. It was aggressive. It was chaotic. It was perfect. And what if he says no? I asked. Chloe shrugged, her fingers tightening possessively against my lower back. Then we walk out. We take the Miller account, we start our own firm, and we bankrupt him within a year. But right now, Miss Architect, she shifted her weight, rolling so that I was pressed firmly against the pillows, her body blanketing mine in a heavy, glorious wave of heat. She leaned down, her lips hovering just millimeters above mine, her breath warm against my mouth. Right now, she whispered, we have more pressing survival tactics to practice. End of Part 5. Part 6, The Freezing Reality. Concept of time had completely dissolved, replaced entirely by the rhythm of the howling wind outside and the steady, reassuring rise and fall of Chloe's chest against mine. I had spent my entire adult life governed by strict schedules, digital calendars, and the relentless ticking of the clock on my office wall. But here, trapped in a pocket of warmth beneath layers of velvet and down, hours slipped by unnoticed, measured only by the shifting glow of the embers and the lingering taste of vanilla and smoke on my lips. When the faint, ghostly blue light of the late morning finally managed to pierce the thick layer of snow caking the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, the brutal reality of our situation began to aggressively knock on the invisible walls of our sanctuary. My stomach gave a loud, treacherous rumble, shattering the quiet intimacy of the space. Chloe, who had been lazily tracing abstract patterns on the bare skin of my waist beneath my cardigan, stopped. A low, vibrating chuckle rumbled in her chest. She propped herself up on one elbow, her messy golden-brown hair falling across her face in a way that was wildly unfair. Was that a bear outside, or is the great Emma Davis finally admitting she has basic human needs? She teased, her voice still thick and raspy with sleep. I felt a hot flush creep up my neck. I haven't eaten since we stopped for stale coffee in Denver yesterday morning, I defended myself, though I couldn't suppress the small smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. And neither have you. Which means logically we need to secure sustenance. Chloe groaned dramatically, letting her head drop back down onto my chest with a soft thud. Logically, leaving this blanket fort is a suicide mission. Have you felt the air out there? It's basically the Arctic Circle in Vanguard's living room. We can't survive on body heat alone, Chloe, I reasoned, though my hands instinctively tightened around her, entirely reluctant to let her go. I am willing to test that theory, she murmured, leaning up to press a lingering, devastatingly soft kiss just below my jawline. My breath hitched, and for a terrifying second I was ready to abandon all logic and stay buried under the covers until the spring thaw. But then, a brutal gust of wind slammed against the glass panes of the cabin, shaking the heavy wooden beams above us. It was a stark, aggressive reminder that nature did not care about our newly discovered feelings. "We need water," I said, forcing my corporate problem-solving tone back into my voice, even as my fingers gently tangled in her hair. "And we need calories. If our core temperatures drop, we'll start making mistakes. I am not losing the vice president title because I got brain fog from a lack of granola bars." Chloe sighed, the heavy sound of a woman entirely defeated by my stubbornness. She rolled off me, and the immediate loss of her heavy, radiating warmth was shocking. "Fine. But I am claiming the first rights to whatever decent snacks are left in that obscenely large pantry." Leaving the insulated nest was agonizing. The moment we pushed back the heavy down comforters, the ambient temperature of the cabin hit us like a physical wall of ice. My breath instantly plumed into a thick white cloud in the air. The fire we had stoked hours ago was still burning steadily, but its heat couldn't reach beyond our immediate perimeter. The rest of the massive open-plan A-frame cabin was a frozen, shadowy cavern. We both scrambled into our heavy winter coats, which we had discarded on the edges of the rug the night before. I pulled a thick beanie over my messy hair, grabbing my phone to use the flashlight. It was down to 40% battery. "Keep your phone off," I instructed, my teeth already beginning to chatter. "We need to conserve battery. Use mine to guide us." Chloe nodded, zipping her expensive, fur-lined parka up to her chin. She looked like an Arctic explorer stepping onto a Vogue cover. It was infuriating. "Lead the way, Captain." We moved out of the faint golden circle of the firelight and stepped into the freezing gloom. The hardwood floors were like blocks of ice through my thick woolen socks. We walked closely together, our shoulders brushing with every step, a silent mutual agreement to maintain contact in the terrifyingly dark space. When we reached the kitchen, the silence was deafening. There was no hum from the massive stainless steel refrigerator, no soft LED lights on the oven. It was an expensive, useless graveyard of modern appliances. I went straight to the massive chrome sink on the kitchen island and pushed the lever up. Nothing happened. I pushed it harder, panic beginning to form a tight knot in my throat. I tapped the metal spout. Not a single drop of water emerged. "Emma?" Chloe asked, sensing the sudden rigidity in my posture. "The pipes," I whispered, a cold dread washing over me that had nothing to do with the temperature. "The ambient temperature dropped too fast last night. The water lines are completely frozen solid." Chloe stepped closer, the beam of my phone flashlight illuminating her wide, worried eyes. "Okay. No running water. What does that mean?" "The bottles." "I checked the pantry yesterday," I replied, my mind racing through a million terrifying variables. "Richard didn't stock bottled water. He assumed we'd just use the filtered tap. It's a luxury cabin. He didn't plan for a disaster." "Okay, don't panic," Chloe said softly. It was strange hearing her use my usual calm, authoritative tone. She reached out, her gloved hand gripping my upper arm firmly. "We are surrounded by literally millions of gallons of frozen water. We just need to melt snow." I stared at her, my panic slowly receding as logic took over again. "Right. Snow. We have a fire. We have giant, ridiculously expensive copper pots hanging from that rack." "Exactly," she smiled, a tight but reassuring expression. "You gather the food. Find anything high in calories that doesn't need to be cooked or can be heated in a pot over an open flame. I will brave the elements and harvest the snow." "Be careful," I said instinctively, the words leaving my mouth before I could analyze them. "The wind is brutal out there. Don't go past the deck." Chloe's expression softened, the sharp edges of her survival mode melting for just a fraction of a second. "I'll be right back. I promise." I handed her the largest pot I could unhook from the ceiling rack and watched as she navigated toward the massive sliding glass doors that led to the back deck. As she unlocked the latch and forced the heavy door open just a crack, a terrifying, violent shriek of wind tore into the room, bringing a flurry of blinding white snow with it. It took all of her strength to push the door open wide enough to slip the pot outside, scooping up a massive mound of untouched snow before slamming it shut and locking it again. She leaned against the glass, panting, her face flushed red from the 3 seconds of exposure. "Okay," she gasped. "That is aggressively unpleasant." While she carried the heavy pot back to the living room, I raided the massive walk-in pantry. My flashlight beam swept over rows of useless gourmet ingredients: truffle oil, artisanal pasta, jars of imported olives. Finally, in the back corner, I found the survival jackpot, a heavy box of emergency supplies meant for the caretakers. There were 3 cans of thick beef stew, a large tin of coffee grounds, and a massive family-sized box of protein bars. I gathered the loot into my arms and hurried back to the sanctuary of the living room. Chloe was already kneeling by the hearth. She had managed to rig the heavy copper pot over the flames, balancing it precariously on 2 massive, unburnt oak logs. "You found the gold mine," she noted, her eyes lighting up as I dumped the cans and boxes onto the rug inside our blanket fort. "Dinner is served," I replied, dropping to my knees beside her and immediately holding my freezing hands out toward the flames. "Or breakfast. I honestly have no idea what time it is." We sat in companionable silence, watching the mountain of snow inside the copper pot slowly begin to collapse and turn to water. The heat of the fire was glorious, a stark contrast to the deathly chill of the kitchen we had just escaped. "I was so angry when Richard gave you the Harrison account," I murmured suddenly, staring blankly at the flames. I wasn't entirely sure why I brought it up, but in the quiet, desperate intimacy of the cabin, the truth felt like it needed to be spoken. Chloe looked away from the fire, turning her head to look at me. "I know you were. I spent 3 weeks building that pitch," I continued, my voice quiet but steady. "I skipped my sister's birthday dinner to finalize the data models. And then you walked in on a Tuesday completely unscripted and charmed the CEO into signing with your strategy instead. I went to the bathroom on the 4th floor and cried for 20 minutes. Chloe's face fell, a flash of genuine guilt crossing her features. "Emma, I'm not saying it to make you feel bad," I interrupted softly, reaching out to gently interlock my fingers with hers. Her hand was still cold, and I squeezed it tightly. "I'm saying it because I realized something. I wasn't just crying because I lost the account. I was crying because I was terrified that no matter how hard I worked, no matter how perfect my spreadsheets were, I would never have that thing that you have. That effortless gravity that pulls people towards you." Chloe squeezed my hand back, her thumb stroking the back of my knuckles. "It isn't effortless, Emma," she confessed, her voice thick with emotion. "It's a performance. It's an exhausting, terrifying performance. The reason I don't use data models is because I'm terrified I'll mess them up. The reason I rely on charm is because I've spent my whole life being told that if people don't like me, I have no value." She let out a shaky breath, leaning her head onto my shoulder. "I watched you build those pitches. I watched you command a room with nothing but pure, undeniable intellect and hard facts. You didn't need them to like you, you just made them respect you. I wanted to be like that so badly it physically hurt." I rested my cheek against the top of her beanie, completely overwhelmed by the profound shift in our reality. We had spent 3 years looking at each other across a battlefield, entirely blinded by our own insecurities, never realizing we were both desperately envying the weapons the other held. The snow in the pot finally began to bubble, a soft, hissing boil that signaled our victory over the frozen pipes. I grabbed one of the cans of beef stew and used my pocket knife to pry the lid open, carefully pouring the thick contents into the boiling water to heat it up. We didn't have bowls, so we sat huddled together under the blankets, passing the heavy copper pot back and forth, eating the scalding hot, watered-down stew directly with 2 silver spoons. It was, without a doubt, the best meal of my entire life. We had just finished the last spoonful, a comfortable, warm silence settling over us, when a sudden, terrifying sound ripped through the cabin. It wasn't the wind. It was a deep, agonizing, structural groan that seemed to come from directly above our heads. It sounded like the very bones of the massive A-frame cabin were twisting in agony. Chloe froze, the silver spoon dropping from her hand and clattering loudly against the copper pot. Her eyes snapped to the vaulted wooden ceiling, wide with sudden terror. "What was that?" she whispered. Before I could answer, a second groan echoed, louder and sharper this time, followed by the terrifying sound of something massive and heavy snapping in half on the roof. The entire cabin shuddered violently, shaking dust and small splinters of wood down onto our blanket fort. The storm wasn't just trapping us anymore. It was trying to crush us. End of Part 6. Part 7, The Collapse. The sound was apocalyptic. It wasn't just a crack. It was the agonizing, prolonged shriek of heavy timber being pushed beyond its absolute physical limit. I didn't think. The analytical, calculating part of my brain entirely shut down, replaced instantly by pure, primal instinct. I lunged forward, grabbing the thick lapels of Chloe's fur-lined parka, and violently yanked her backward. We tumbled backward, entirely clearing the boundaries of our makeshift blanket fort just as a second deafening crash shook the very foundations of the luxury cabin. Above us, the soaring, vaulted ceiling of the A-frame living room bowed inward with a horrifying groan. A massive, jagged crack ripped through the drywall along the central wooden beam, raining a heavy shower of white plaster dust and wood splinters directly onto the Persian rug where we had been sitting mere seconds before. Chloe gasped, scrambling backward on her hands and knees until her back hit the heavy velvet sectional sofa. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the ceiling, completely paralyzed by the sheer violence of the noise. "The roof!" she choked out, her voice barely audible over the roaring wind outside. "Emma, the roof is caving in." "A tree!" I yelled back, my heart hammering against my ribs with such force it felt like it was trying to break through my sternum. One of the old pines must have snapped under the weight of the snow and fallen onto the house. The A-frame is strong, but that central beam is compromised. As if to confirm my terrifying assessment, another deep structural groan echoed through the cavernous room. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows rattled furiously in their frames, the glass bowing inward under the immense pressure of the blizzard. "We can't stay here," I said, forcing myself to stand up on legs that felt like they were made of jelly. The beautiful, roaring fire we had painstakingly built was now a deadly hazard. If the roof collapsed, it would scatter the burning logs across the dry hardwood floors, turning the cabin into an inescapable inferno. "We have to move to the basement. Now." "The basement?" Chloe repeated, finally tearing her eyes away from the splintering ceiling to look at me. "Emma, there's no fireplace down there. Surrounded by frozen earth. We'll freeze to death in hours. If we stay here, we'll be crushed in minutes," I countered, my voice leaving absolutely no room for argument. "We are going down. Grab the comforters. Take the heavy ones. I'll get the food and the water." The spell of our quiet, romantic intimacy was completely shattered, replaced by the chaotic, terrifying scramble for survival. I threw my phone flashlight on, the beam cutting through the thick cloud of plaster dust still hanging in the freezing air. Chloe didn't argue again. She moved with frantic, trembling speed, stripping the heavy down comforters and the thick woolen throws from our abandoned nest and bundling them into her arms. I grabbed the half-empty box of protein bars, the remaining cans of stew, and the heavy copper pot filled with the snow water we had just boiled. It was still hot to the touch, and I silently thanked God for the residual heat. "Go!" I yelled, shining the flashlight beam toward the rear hallway of the cabin. We ran. Or rather, we stumbled as quickly as we could through the freezing, pitch-black darkness of the cabin, the heavy burdens in our arms slowing us down. The floorboards beneath our feet felt unstable, vibrating with the continuous, violent assault of the storm outside. Every step we took was accompanied by the terrifying symphony of the cabin dying around us, wood groaning, glass rattling, wind screaming. We reached the utility hallway. The basement door was a heavy, solid oak slab at the end of the corridor. I dropped the food box, yanked the handle down, and shoved the door open, revealing a narrow flight of wooden stairs descending into absolute suffocating blackness. "Careful," I warned, pointing the beam of light down the steps. "Hold the rail." Chloe went first, practically blind over the mountain of blankets in her arms. I followed closely behind, carefully balancing the heavy copper pot of water so it wouldn't slosh over the sides. The moment we descended below the ground level, the oppressive, terrifying noise of the storm was instantly muffled, replaced by an eerie, tomb-like silence. But the drop in temperature was immediate and brutal. The basement was a fully finished space, likely a game room or a wine cellar, but without the massive central heating system running, it was essentially a concrete icebox. The air down here was heavy, stagnant, and so unimaginably cold that the moisture in my breath instantly crystallized, stinging my nostrils. "Drop the blankets in the corner," I instructed, my voice echoing loudly against the concrete walls. "Against the interior wall, away from the foundation. It will be slightly warmer." Chloe dumped the massive pile of fabric onto the floor, immediately wrapping her arms around her chest and shivering violently. Her teeth were chattering so loudly I could hear them clicking from 5 feet away. The adrenaline that had propelled us down the stairs was rapidly fading, leaving her completely exposed to the bitter chill. I set the water and the food down and immediately went to work. I spread the thickest comforter onto the freezing carpet, then layered the heavy woolen throws on top to create a barrier between us and the frozen ground. "Get in," I ordered, holding up the edge of the final massive down comforter. Chloe didn't hesitate. She crawled onto the makeshift bed, curling her knees tightly to her chest. I slid in right behind her, dragging the heavy fabric entirely over our heads, plunging us once again into absolute suffocating darkness. I switched off my phone flashlight to conserve the dying battery, relying entirely on touch. The dynamic had completely shifted. Upstairs, Chloe had been the one to initiate the embrace, the one to confidently pull me into her warmth. But down here, in the terrifying, freezing dark, she was unraveling. She was shaking uncontrollably, short, frantic gasps of air escaping her lips. It wasn't just the cold, it was the shock. The realization that our lives were actually in danger, that the luxury cabin was no longer a beautiful prison but a collapsing trap, had finally broken through her effortless, confident armor. "Hey," I whispered, shifting closer until my chest was pressed firmly against her back. "Hey, it's okay. We're safe down here. The ceiling is concrete and reinforced steel. The roof can't crush us." I wrapped my arms completely around her, pulling her back against me. I locked my legs around hers, essentially turning myself into a human-weighted blanket. I buried my face in her messy hair, my own body shivering in the frigid air, but I forced my muscles to relax, trying to project a calm I absolutely did not feel. "I'm scared, Emma," she confessed, her voice incredibly small, trembling so hard the words barely made it out. It was the most honest, vulnerable thing I had ever heard her say. "I know," I murmured, tightening my grip on her. "I'm terrified, too. But I need you to breathe. Deep, slow breaths. You're hyperventilating and you're losing heat." "I can't," she choked out, a genuine sob catching in her throat. "I can't stop shaking." "Yes, you can," I said firmly but gently. I unzipped my cardigan and pushed my hands underneath the heavy hem of her sweater, pressing my palms directly against the freezing, bare skin of her stomach. She gasped at the initial contact, but then leaned heavily into my touch. "Focus on my hands, Chloe. Just focus on my hands." We lay there in the pitch black, the profound silence of the basement only broken by the frantic, terrified sound of her breathing and the muffled, distant groaning of the cabin above us. For a woman who had spent 3 years commanding boardrooms and bending executives to her will, seeing her this helpless sent a fierce, overwhelming surge of protectiveness through my veins. I realized with a startling clarity that I didn't just want to beat Chloe Bennett at Vanguard Media. I wanted to protect her. I wanted to be the immovable object she could anchor herself to when her chaotic world finally spun out of control. Slowly, agonizingly so, the violent tremors racking her body began to subside. The radiant heat from my body, trapped beneath the heavy down comforters, slowly began to seep into her freezing skin. Her breathing leveled out, matching the deep, steady rhythm I was purposefully maintaining against her back. "There you go," I whispered against her neck, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to the freezing skin just beneath her ear. "You're okay. I've got you." Chloe let out a long, shuddering sigh, completely melting backward into my embrace. Her hands found mine where they rested against her stomach, her cold fingers interlocking tightly with my own. "You're a really good architect, Emma," she whispered weakly into the darkness, a faint trace of her usual dry humor finally returning to her voice. "I told you," I replied, a tired smile spreading across my face despite the freezing temperature. "I fix things. I bring order to chaos. Are you going to fix this?" she asked, shifting slightly so she could turn her head and look over her shoulder. I couldn't see her face in the absolute blackness, but I could feel her breath ghosting across my cheek. "I'm going to get us out of here, Chloe. I promise you." "And after that?" she asked, her voice dropping to a low, magnetic whisper that made my heart stutter. "When the snow melts and we go back to the real world. What are you going to fix then?" I closed my eyes, pulling her impossibly closer, the absolute certainty of my answer surprising even me. "Us," I whispered back. End of Part 7. Part 8, The Weight of the Dark. The darkness in the basement was absolute, a heavy, suffocating void that stripped away every sense except touch and sound. Without the visual cues of the world around us, the boundaries of where my body ended and Chloe's began completely blurred. We were just a tangled knot of limbs, shared breath, and desperate body heat, anchored together in a concrete box while the world above us tore itself to pieces. I had no idea how much time had passed. Could have been 3 hours, it could have been 10. The muffled, agonizing groans of the A-frame cabin above us had settled into a sporadic, terrifying creak, but the storm outside continued to rage with an unrelenting, dull roar. Underneath the mountain of heavy down comforters, the initial shock of the freezing basement had slowly given way to a dangerous, creeping numbness. My body, which had been burning through calories and adrenaline to radiate heat into Chloe's freezing skin, was finally beginning to tap out. The violent shivers that had racked my frame for the first few hours were slowing down, replaced by a heavy, intoxicating lethargy that pulled at my eyelids like lead weights. "Tell me something I don't know about you," Chloe whispered, her voice slicing through the heavy silence. She shifted in my arms, turning fully to face me in the pitch black. She tucked her freezing nose against my jawline, her fingers tracing absent-minded, soothing circles against my back. "I thought you spent the last 3 years studying my every move," I mumbled, my words slurring slightly. My tongue felt thick, and formulating a coherent thought was suddenly taking a monumental amount of effort. "I studied the Vanguard version of you," she corrected softly, her thumb brushing against my collarbone. "I know that you take your coffee black, you organize your inbox by color-coded priority levels, and you have a terrifying tell when someone presents flawed data. Your left eyebrow twitches." A faint ghost of a smile touched my lips. "It does not twitch. It absolutely does. It's adorable. But that's the executive Emma. I want to know the woman who builds fires and knows how to ration survival supplies. Tell me a secret." I closed my eyes, letting my head loll back against the freezing carpet beneath our blankets. The urge to just drift away, to let the exhaustion pull me under into a dreamless sleep, was overwhelming. "I don't have any secrets, Chloe. I'm exactly as boring and predictable as I appear." "You are a lot of things, Emma Davis, but boring is entirely off the table," she whispered. Her hand stopped its soothing circles and suddenly gripped my shoulder tightly. "Emma, open your eyes. It's pitch black, Chloe." "There's nothing to see," I murmured, ignoring her command. "Emma, you stopped shivering." Her voice had lost its playful, intimate edge. It was suddenly sharp, laced with a rising panic. She pushed herself up on one elbow, the sudden movement letting a brutal draft of sub-zero air into our cocoon. "I'm just tired," I breathed out, the cold air barely even registering against my skin anymore. "Just going to close my eyes for a minute." "No," Chloe practically shouted, the sound echoing harshly off the concrete walls. "No, you are not closing your eyes. Do you hear me? Emma, wake up." Before I could protest, she was moving with frantic, terrifying energy. She violently kicked the heavy comforters off her upper body. I heard the sharp zip of her fur-lined parka, followed by the rustle of heavy fabric being discarded. A second later, she threw her body directly on top of mine. The shock of it made me gasp. She had stripped off her outer layers, and now the soft wool of her oversized sweater was pressed flush against my unzipped cardigan. She aggressively grabbed my face in both of her hands, her palms stinging my numb cheeks. "Look at me," she commanded, her voice cracking. "I can't see you, but I need you to look at me right now." I forced my heavy eyelids open, staring blindly into the dark where I knew her face was hovering just inches above mine. "You took your coat off," I mumbled, my brain struggling to process the information. "You're going to freeze." "I'm going to freeze if you die on me, you stubborn idiot," she cried out, and I could feel a hot, wet tear drop from her cheek to land squarely on my nose. "You gave me all your heat. You spent the last however many hours acting as my personal furnace, and you didn't say a damn word while your own core temperature dropped. How could you be so stupid?" "I was protecting my investment," I slurred, attempting a joke that fell entirely flat. "Can't be co-vice presidents if one of us is an icicle." "Shut up," she sobbed, burying her face into my neck. "Just shut up and stay awake. Please, Emma. Talk to me. Tell me the secret. Anything. Just keep talking." The sheer terror in her voice finally managed to pierce through the heavy, toxic fog of hypothermia settling over my brain. Chloe Bennett, the most composed, untouchable woman I had ever met, was sobbing over me in a freezing basement. Triggered a deep, primal spike of adrenaline in my chest. "I wanted to be an architect," I rasped out, my voice barely a whisper. I forced my numb arms to lift, wrapping them around her waist to pull her tight against me, desperate to absorb whatever heat she was generating. "What?" she sniffled, her hands frantically rubbing up and down my arms, creating a desperate friction to warm my blood. "Not a metaphorical one," I continued, forcing my brain to latch onto the memory, forcing the words out to keep myself anchored to reality. "A real one. When I was a kid, I used to build these massive, sprawling cities out of whatever I could find. Blocks, cardboard, books. My dad would bring home graph paper from his office, and I would spend hours drawing blueprints for houses that made no logical sense." "Why didn't you?" Chloe asked, her breath hot against my collarbone. Her hands didn't stop moving, her frantic ministrations slowly beginning to send a painful, prickling sensation of returning circulation down my arms. "Because it was risky," I admitted, the truth hanging heavy in the dark space. "Because architecture requires a leap of faith into creativity, and I was terrified of failing. So I chose data. I chose spreadsheets and guaranteed margins. I chose a corporate ladder where the rungs were clearly defined. I chose safe." Chloe's hands stopped moving. She shifted her weight, sliding her hands up to cup my face again, her thumbs gently tracing my cheekbones. "You think you're safe, Emma?" she whispered softly. "I did," I replied, my heart finally beginning to thud with a recognizable steady rhythm against my ribs. The adrenaline was working. Until Richard locked me in a luxury cabin with a hurricane in a designer sweater. A wet, breathless laugh escaped her lips. "I prefer to think of myself as a highly localized tornado, actually. Whatever you are, Chloe, you entirely ruined my perfectly ordered life." "I'm sorry," she murmured, though she didn't sound sorry at all. She leaned down, and in the pitch black, her lips found mine with terrifying accuracy. It wasn't the slow, desperate, questioning kiss we had shared upstairs in the glow of the dying fire. This was fierce. It was demanding. It was an absolute lifeline thrown into the dark. She kissed me like she was trying to physically breathe life back into my lungs, her mouth moving against mine with an aggressive, bruising passion that completely shattered the lingering lethargy in my veins. My hands tangled violently into her hair, pulling her down until there wasn't a single millimeter of space left between us. The sheer force of it, the intoxicating taste of her, the frantic beat of her heart against my chest, the overwhelming realization that she was fighting for me, ignited a roaring fire in my blood that no Aspen blizzard could ever touch. I kissed her back with everything I had left, pouring 3 years of unspoken longing, rivalry, and a sudden, terrifyingly profound affection into the connection. We were stranded in the dark, surrounded by freezing concrete and a collapsing house, but in that exact moment I had never felt more alive. When we finally broke apart, we were both gasping for air, our chests heaving against each other. "You're awake," she whispered fiercely against my lips, her breath ragged. "I'm awake," I confirmed, my voice entirely steady. The dangerous numbness was gone, replaced by a deep, radiating heat that started in my chest and pumped out to my fingertips. "God," she breathed out, resting her forehead against mine. "Don't you ever do that to me again. If you want to play the martyr, do it on company time." I opened my mouth to fire back a sarcastic retort, but the words died in my throat. The air around us had changed. It was a subtle shift, but after hours of heightened sensory deprivation, it hit me like a physical blow. The oppressive, vibrating roar of the wind that had been shaking the foundation of the house for the past 24 hours was gone. I froze, straining my ears in the dark. "Emma?" Chloe asked, sensing the sudden tension in my body. "Listen," I whispered. We both held our breath. The silence was deafening. There was no wind. There was no groaning timber. There was only the faint, steady drip of melting ice from somewhere deep within the walls of the basement. "The storm," Chloe breathed out, disbelief lacing her voice. It stopped. Before I could answer, a faint, ghostly gray light suddenly materialized in the darkness to our far left. I blinked, my eyes watering as they desperately tried to adjust to the illumination. High up on the concrete wall, near the ceiling, a small, rectangular basement window had been buried under the snowpack. Now, with the storm broken, a sliver of the morning sun was managing to pierce through the icy barrier, casting a pale, beautiful beam of light directly onto the dusty concrete floor. We had survived the night. End of Part 8. Part 9, the morning after. The sliver of morning sun cutting through the basement window was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. It wasn't warm, it was a pale, icy gray that spoke of a frozen world above, but it was light. It was undeniable proof that the earth was still spinning, the sun had still risen, and we had actually survived the longest night of our lives. I stared at the dusty beam of light illuminating the concrete floor, my chest rising and falling in slow, steady rhythms. The terrifying numbness was entirely gone, replaced by the heavy, aching reality of a body that had been pushed to its absolute physical limits. Every single muscle in my back and legs screamed in protest, stiff and sore from the freezing temperatures and the hard floor. "Is it really over?" Chloe's voice was a fragile whisper breaking the utter silence of the basement. I turned my head. In the dim, filtered light, I could finally see her face clearly. She looked exhausted. Her golden brown hair was a tangled, static-filled mess, her lips were pale, and there were dark purple shadows beneath her striking green eyes. But to me, in the ruins of our corporate retreat, she looked absolutely breathtaking. "The storm has passed," I confirmed, my voice raspy and dry. Chloe didn't immediately jump up to celebrate. Instead, she let out a long, shaky exhale, her eyes fluttering shut as she pressed her forehead firmly against my collarbone. She wrapped her arms tighter around my waist beneath the heavy layers of our down comforter cocoon, seemingly unwilling to let go of the sanctuary we had built in the dark. "I don't want to go upstairs," she murmured into my sweater. "We can't live in the basement, Chloe," I replied softly, my hand instinctively finding its way to the nape of her neck, my fingers gently combing through her tangled hair. "We don't have enough beef stew to sustain a subterranean lifestyle." Plus, your wardrobe is far too expensive for concrete floors. A faint, tired smile touched her lips. I could make it work. I could make basement chic a thing. I have no doubt you could convince the entire Vanguard executive board to start holding meetings in root cellars by next Tuesday, I chuckled, though the sound was weak. But logically, we need to assess the damage. And we need to see if we can signal for help. The roads will be completely impassable. Reluctance radiated from her in waves, but the chaotic, unpredictable Chloe Bennett had completely yielded to our new, unspoken partnership. With a heavy sigh, she slowly unwound her limbs from mine. Pushing the heavy blankets off was a brutal reminder of our reality. The basement air was still deathly cold, hovering just above freezing. We were both shivering instantly, our breath pluming in the gray light as we scrambled to put our heavy winter coats back on. My fingers were stiff and clumsy, struggling with the zipper of my cardigan until Chloe gently swatted my hands away and zipped it up for me, her knuckles brushing affectionately against my chin. "Ready?" she asked, her green eyes holding mine with an intensity that made my stomach flutter. "Ready," I nodded. We walked to the wooden stairs together, our hands tightly interlocked. The eerie silence of the cabin was deeply unsettling after 24 hours of deafening, violent noise. I pushed the heavy oak door open, wincing as the hinges squealed loudly in the quiet space, and we stepped up into the main hallway. The destruction was absolute. We walked slowly into the massive, open-plan living room, stopping dead in our tracks. The A-frame cabin, which had been a masterpiece of luxury architecture just 2 days ago, looked like the site of a bomb blast. The central vaulted ceiling had completely caved in. A massive, ancient pine tree, easily 3 feet in diameter, had snapped under the weight of the blizzard and crashed directly through the roof. Its heavy, snow-laden branches were currently resting squarely on the crushed remains of the velvet sectional sofa where we had built our first blanket fort. The floor-to-ceiling windows on the far wall had shattered entirely, leaving a gaping, jagged hole that exposed the living room directly to the frozen mountain air. Thick, white snow had drifted inside, covering the expensive Persian rugs and the hardwood floors in a pristine, glittering blanket. The fireplace was a ruined pile of wet ash and crushed stone. "Oh my God," Chloe whispered, her grip on my hand tightening painfully. I stared at the crushed sofa, a cold dread washing over me that had nothing to do with the temperature. If we had stayed up here... My voice trailed off, the horrific realization hitting me like a freight train. If we hadn't moved to the basement when we did, if the roof had given way even 5 minutes earlier, we wouldn't be standing here right now. Chloe turned to me, her eyes wide with the exact same realization. Without a word, she threw her arms around my neck, burying her face into my shoulder, pulling me into a fierce, desperate hug. I wrapped my arms around her waist, holding her just as tightly, resting my chin on top of her beanie. We stood there in the ruins of the living room, surrounded by shattered glass and broken timber, just holding each other in the freezing morning air. "You saved my life, Emma," she whispered fiercely, her voice trembling. "You made us go to the basement. You saved us." "We saved each other," I corrected softly, pressing a kiss to the side of her head. "I was freezing to death down there, and you forced me to stay awake. It was a team effort." She pulled back slightly, looking up at me with an expression so open and vulnerable it made my heart ache. The sharp corporate armor that had defined our relationship for 3 years was entirely gone, shattered right alongside the luxury cabin. "So," she said, managing a shaky, breathtaking smile, "how does a team like us get off this mountain?" I turned my analytical brain back on, scanning the absolute devastation. The massive windows were gone, which meant we had a clear view of the outside world. The blizzard had left behind a landscape that was both terrifying and stunningly beautiful. The jagged peaks of Aspen were buried under several feet of pristine, untouched white powder. The sky above was a brilliant, blinding blue, completely devoid of clouds. "We don't get off the mountain," I concluded, pointing toward the driveway. Or rather, where the driveway used to be. My SUV was entirely buried. Only the very tip of the radio antenna was visible above the massive snowdrift. We wait. Richard knows we're up here. When we don't check in by tomorrow morning, he'll send someone. The caretaker, a snowplow someone. We have to survive another day in this? Chloe asked, looking around the frozen, open-air living room. We survive in the basement, I corrected. We have the blankets. We have 2 cans of stew left and a box of protein bars. We melt snow in the copper pot using body heat if we have to. We just have to hold the line until they dig us out. Hold the line, Chloe repeated, stepping closer and slipping her arms around my waist inside my open winter coat, seeking my body heat. That sounds incredibly boring. Didn't you say you wanted to be an architect? Can't you build us a better shelter out of this debris? I laughed out loud, a genuine ringing sound that echoed strangely in the ruined space. I build with spreadsheets, Chloe, not actual chainsaws. You're going to have to settle for the blanket fort. I can live with that, she murmured, leaning in and capturing my lips in a soft, sweet kiss that tasted like cold air and absolute relief. It was entirely different from the desperate, frantic kisses in the dark. This was slow, deliberate, and full of a terrifying promise for the future. Standing in the middle of a disaster zone, surrounded by the physical manifestation of Richard's terrible management decisions, I felt more grounded and certain than I ever had in a corner office. We spent the next hour carefully scavenging what we could from the wreckage. I managed to salvage a few unbroken bottles of water from a cabinet that hadn't been crushed, and Chloe miraculously found an intact bag of marshmallows in the pantry. Essential survival calories, she declared defensively when I raised an eyebrow at her discovery. We retreated back to the basement, dragging our meager supplies with us. Without the imminent threat of the collapsing roof or the roaring wind, the concrete room felt less like a tomb and more like a strange, quiet sanctuary. We rebuilt our nest, layering the down comforters into a massive, heavily insulated bed. We sat cross-legged facing each other, passing a protein bar back and forth, entirely comfortable in the silence. What happens when we go back, Emma? Chloe asked suddenly. She was holding a marshmallow, methodically picking it apart, refusing to meet my eyes. The reality of Monday morning was slowly creeping back into our isolated bubble. To Vanguard. To Richard. To the vacant VP position. I took a deep breath, looking at the woman who had tormented my professional life for 3 years, and realized I didn't care about Vanguard Media anymore. Not if it meant losing what we had just found in the dark. I meant what I said last night, I told her, my voice steady and resolute. I am not fighting you for that promotion. I refuse to go back to being your enemy. Chloe looked up, her green eyes searching my face for any sign of hesitation. She found none. Co-vice presidents, she said softly, a spark of that familiar, brilliant ambition returning to her eyes. We walk into his office, we drop a flawless, unified pitch for the Miller account on his desk, and we demand he promotes both of us. We tell him we synergized. A smile broke across my face. It was completely insane. Richard would have an aneurysm. The board would lose their minds. And if he refuses? I asked, echoing her own words from the night before. Chloe leaned forward, reaching out to gently trace the line of my jaw with her thumb. The chaotic, untouchable golden girl was gone, replaced by a partner who was entirely ready to go to war with me instead of against me. Then we burn Vanguard Media to the ground, she whispered, a fierce, beautiful grin lighting up her face. Together. I opened my mouth to reply, completely ready to agree to professional sabotage when a sound stopped me cold. It was faint at first, muffled by the layers of snow and concrete, but it was growing steadily louder. A deep, mechanical rumble. Chloe froze, her thumb stopping on my jawline. Do you hear that? I scrambled to my feet, my heart leaping into my throat. I ran up the wooden stairs, completely ignoring the burning in my stiff muscles, and pushed the heavy door open. I sprinted through the ruined hallway and into the destroyed living room, ignoring the crunch of snow and glass beneath my boots. I reached the gaping hole where the massive windows used to be and looked out across the pristine white valley. In the distance, cutting a massive dark path through the untouched snow on the mountain road, were the flashing yellow lights of a heavy-duty county snowplow. And right behind it, creeping slowly up the treacherous incline, was a Vanguard Media Company SUV. The real world had arrived. End of Part 9. Part 10, The Vanguard Ultimatum. The mechanical roar of the heavy-duty county snowplow was the loudest sound I had ever heard, a brutal, jarring contrast to the deathly silence of the frozen mountain. I stood in the wreckage of the living room, the icy wind whipping my hair across my face, watching as the massive yellow blade pushed literal tons of snow out of the way. Behind it, the black Vanguard Media SUV crawled up the cleared path like a nervous metal insect. I felt a warm, gloved hand slip into mine. I didn't need to look to know it was Chloe. Her fingers immediately interlocked with my own, a firm, grounding anchor amidst the sudden influx of reality. "Showtime, Emma," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the rumble of the approaching diesel engines. "Showtime," I echoed. The SUV threw itself into park before it had even fully stopped. 4 men in heavy neon-orange rescue gear piled out, alongside a very pale, very terrified-looking Vanguard HR representative named David. They scrambled up the icy driveway, their boots crunching loudly in the snow, stopping dead in their tracks when they saw the cabin. Or rather, what was left of it. The massive pine tree had effectively cleaved the A-frame in half. From the outside, the luxury retreat looked like a crushed dollhouse. "Oh my God," David gasped, his breath pluming in the freezing air. He looked from the destroyed roof to the two of us standing amidst the shattered glass, completely unscathed, holding hands. "You're alive." Richard thought when the satellite phone went down and the storm hit, we thought you were dead. Chloe offered him a smile that was entirely terrifying in its absolute icy composure. It was the smile of a woman who had just survived the apocalypse and realized she was stronger than it. "It takes a lot more than a little snow and a falling tree to kill us, David," she said smoothly, her grip on my hand tightening slightly. "Though I strongly suggest Vanguard reevaluates its corporate retreat properties. The structural integrity of this place was deeply substandard." An hour later, we were sitting in the heated back seat of the SUV, wrapped in thermal foil blankets, nursing lukewarm coffees from thermoses. The physical distance between us was virtually non-existent. My leg was pressed firmly against hers, our shoulders touching with every bump in the road. David sat in the front passenger seat, nervously stealing glances at us through the rearview mirror, clearly entirely confused by the sudden lack of bloodlust between the two women who had notoriously hated each other for 3 years. The ride back to Denver and the subsequent flight to New York passed in a surreal blur. The survival adrenaline was wearing off, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion, but beneath it, burning like a quiet, steady furnace, was a profound sense of clarity. I had boarded the plane on Friday as a woman desperate for a corner office, terrified of being eclipsed. I landed on Sunday night as a woman who had realized the corner office was nothing compared to the person sitting next to me. Monday morning, 9 a.m. The atmosphere in the Vanguard Media boardroom was electric with tension. Richard sat at the head of the massive mahogany table, his hands steepled beneath his chin. To his left sat the executive board, 4 older men in gray suits who looked like they were waiting for a gladiator match to commence. The double glass doors swung open, and the entire room fell dead silent. We didn't walk in. We invaded. I was wearing a tailored charcoal gray suit, my hair pulled back into my signature severe bun, armed with 2 thick, meticulously bound leather folders. But the nervous, frantic energy that usually accompanied my presentations was entirely gone. I felt grounded. I felt lethal. Chloe walked in right beside me, our strides perfectly synchronized. She wore a stunning emerald green blazer that brought out the terrifyingly sharp color of her eyes, her golden brown hair falling in those perfect, effortless waves. But she wasn't relying on charm today. She radiated pure, unfiltered power. We didn't sit on opposite sides of the table, as we had done for the past 36 months. We took the 2 chairs directly across from Richard, sitting shoulder to shoulder. Richard raised an eyebrow, a smug, arrogant little smirk playing on his lips. Ladies, I'm glad to see you survived the mountain. Though I hear my cabin didn't fare quite as well. The cabin was poorly constructed, Richard, I stated, my voice echoing coldly off the glass walls of the boardroom. I didn't smile. I didn't offer the usual corporate pleasantries. I slid one of the leather folders across the polished wood until it stopped perfectly in front of him. But our pitch is not. Richard's smirk faltered slightly at my tone. He opened the folder. The Miller account requires a complete demographic pivot, Chloe began, not waiting for him to read. Her voice was smooth, commanding, and entirely devoid of the playful flirtation she usually used on the board. You've been targeting the 35 to 50 bracket using traditional media. It's a dying strategy. Emma's data proves a 41% drop in engagement over the last 2 quarters using that exact model. The numbers are on page 4, I interjected smoothly without missing a beat, our voices weaving together in a flawless practice symphony. I ran the predictive algorithms against Miller's new product line. If we don't aggressively pivot to digital-first, localized experiential marketing for the 18 to 28 demographic, the Seattle branch's proposal will yield a negative ROI within 8 months. Richard stared at the spreadsheet, his eyes widening. I knew the data was perfect. I had spent the entire flight from Denver finalizing it on my laptop, while Chloe leaned against my shoulder, injecting her creative vision directly into my analytical framework. We are proposing a complete rebrand, Chloe continued, leaning forward, bracing her hands on the table. She completely commanded the room. Every eye was glued to her. We drop the corporate jargon. We create a narrative. We use Emma's localized data nodes to launch pop-up immersive experiences in 12 major cities simultaneously. It's aggressive, it's expensive up front, and it will absolutely dominate the market. For 20 minutes, we systematically dismantled Vanguard's traditional strategies and rebuilt them into something undeniably brilliant. It wasn't my pitch, and it wasn't her pitch. It was an entirely new entity, a terrifying, perfect hybrid of raw, unassailable data and brilliant, visionary creativity. When we finally finished, the silence in the boardroom was absolute. The executives were staring at us, entirely speechless. Richard slowly closed the leather folder. He looked rattled, the smugness completely wiped from his face. He cleared his throat, adjusting his tie. This is exceptional work. The integration of the analytics with the creative strategy is... He paused, looking between the two of us. It's flawless. You actually synergized. We did, Chloe replied simply. Well, Richard leaned back in his chair, regaining a shred of his arrogance, clapping his hands together. It seems my little experiment worked perfectly. I put 2 fighting dogs in a cage, and they finally figured out how to hunt together. The Miller account stays in New York. Congratulations. He paused, a cruel, familiar glint returning to his eye. Now comes the hard part. I told you both that only one of you is walking out of here as the new vice president of strategy. So, who gets it? Who is stepping down? Beneath the heavy mahogany table, hidden from the view of the executive board, Chloe's hand found my knee. Her warm fingers slipped into mine, holding tight. The physical contact sent a jolt of electricity straight up my spine, a visceral reminder of the freezing dark, the collapsing roof, and the promises we made when we thought we had nothing left to lose. I didn't look at her. I didn't need to. Neither of us is stepping down, Richard, I said, my voice eerily calm, holding his gaze with absolute unblinking intensity. Richard let out a short, incredulous laugh. Excuse me, Emma? There is only one VP position. Then you are going to create a second one, Chloe stated, her voice slicing through the room like a perfectly sharpened blade. We are operating as co-vice presidents. We share the title, we share the corner office, and we both receive the commensurate salary increase. The boardroom erupted into hushed, shocked whispers. Richard's face flushed a deep, angry red. That is not how this company works, Chloe. I am the CEO. I do not take demands from my executives, and I certainly don't invent titles because you two suddenly decided to play nice. We aren't playing nice, Richard, I corrected softly. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a single, crisp white envelope, sliding it across the table to land exactly on top of the Miller pitch. We are giving you a choice. Richard stared at the envelope like it was a live grenade. What is this? Those are our joint letters of resignation, Chloe said, a dangerous, brilliant smile finally breaking across her face. You see, Richard, while we were trapped in your structurally deficient cabin, freezing to death, Emma and I realized something. Vanguard Media doesn't make us great. We make Vanguard Media great. I leaned forward, mirroring her posture. If you do not sign off on the co-VP restructure right now, we are walking out of that door. And we are taking this pitch, which we legally drafted off company hours during a weekend where you failed to provide basic safety measures, straight to Miller's internal team. We will start our own firm by Wednesday, and we will take 3 of your biggest accounts with us before the end of the fiscal year. Richard was entirely silent. The vein in his forehead was throbbing violently. He looked at the perfect, undeniable data in the folder, and then he looked at the resignation letters. He looked at me, and he looked at Chloe. He was a shark, but he finally realized he had just been outmaneuvered by 2 apex predators who had decided to hunt as a pack. You're bluffing, he hissed. I didn't say a word. I simply stood up, smoothing the front of my suit jacket. Chloe stood up simultaneously, buttoning her emerald blazer in perfect sync. It was a pleasure working for you, Richard, Chloe said cheerfully. We turned our backs on the CEO of Vanguard Media and began walking toward the glass doors. Wait! The word echoed desperately through the room before we had even taken 3 steps. We stopped, turning back slowly. Richard was gripping the edges of the table, looking incredibly defeated, staring at the pitch folder like it was his only lifeline. 'Cause it was. Fine, he ground out, the words sounding like it tasted like ash in his mouth. Co-vice presidents. My assistant will draft the new contracts by noon. Now sit down and tell me how we execute the first phase of this digital rollout. Chloe and I exchanged a single brief look. The 3 years of bitter rivalry, the countless late nights trying to destroy each other, the agonizing insecurities, it was all completely, irrevocably gone. In its place was a partnership so solid, so terrifyingly powerful, that it had just brought a corporate empire to its knees in under 10 minutes. We walked back to the table, and for the rest of the meeting beneath the mahogany wood, our hands never separated once. 2 weeks later, the physical wall between our adjacent offices had been completely demolished, creating one massive, sprawling executive suite that overlooked the Manhattan skyline. I was standing by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, which, unlike the ones in Aspen, were perfectly intact and completely free of snow. I was looking down at a color-coded spreadsheet on my tablet, completely lost in the data metrics of the Miller rollout. Suddenly, a warm pair of arms wrapped around my waist from behind. Chloe pressed her chest against my back, resting her chin on my shoulder. She smelled like expensive vanilla, amber, and absolute victory. You're doing it again, she murmured, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to the side of my neck. You're obsessing over the margins. I am ensuring our absolute dominance over the 3rd quarter, thank you very much, I replied, though I leaned heavily into her embrace, the tablet instantly forgotten. Put the data away, Emma, she whispered, her hands sliding up to cup my jaw, gently turning my head so she could look into my eyes. The afternoon sun caught the gold flecks in her green eyes, and my breath hitched the exact same way it had in that freezing basement. And do what? I asked, a slow smile spreading across my face. Synergize with your partner, she purred right before her lips crashed down onto mine. It was warm, it was passionate, and it was absolutely perfect. I dropped the tablet onto the desk, turning fully into her arms, tangling my hands into her hair as she pressed me back against the glass overlooking the city we now ruled together. The storm was over, the ice had melted, and I had never felt more safely anchored in my entire life. End of story. Wow, just wow. Take a deep breath with me, everyone, because my heart is still absolutely racing after that ending. Welcome back to reality. What an incredible, intense journey that was. Let's just take a moment to unpack everything that just happened between Emma and Chloe, because there is so much to talk about here. This wasn't just your standard enemies to lovers story. This was an absolute masterclass in breaking down walls, both literally and figuratively. At the beginning, we saw two incredibly ambitious, powerful women who thought they had to tear each other down to survive in a toxic corporate world under a boss like Richard. Emma was entirely driven by logic, data, and this desperate need to be perfect so she wouldn't be overlooked. And then you have Chloe, who used her effortless charm and chaos as a shield because she was terrified of not being enough. They were absolute polar opposites. But then Mother Nature stepped in. That Aspen blizzard, it was like the universe saying, "Okay, ladies, time's up. You're going to deal with this tension right now." I absolutely loved how the physical, freezing cold of the cabin forced them to abandon their corporate armor. They couldn't rely on spreadsheets or pitch meetings. They had to rely on shared body heat and raw trust. That transition in the dark, under those heavy down comforters, when Chloe finally admitted she only fought Emma because it was the only way Emma would truly look at her. Pure cinematic perfection. And can we talk about the climax? When that massive pine tree crashed through the roof and they had to scramble to the freezing concrete basement. That was the ultimate turning point. Emma, who was always so composed, giving up all her body heat to keep Chloe warm to the point of hypothermia. And Chloe, the one who usually avoided hard realities, desperately fighting to keep Emma awake. They stopped fighting against each other and finally started fighting for each other. But my absolute favorite part has to be that ending. Monday morning in the boardroom. We all thought they might just run away and start their own firm, right? But no. They walked in there shoulder to shoulder, dropped a flawless pitch on the table, and essentially held Vanguard Media hostage. Co-vice presidents, or we burn it down. That is the exact kind of power couple energy we live for on this channel. Now it is your turn, and I really want to hear from you. Jump down into the comments and tell me, what was your absolute favorite moment of the story? Was it the first kiss under the blankets, or that absolute boss move in Richard's office? Also, be honest, if you were trapped in a freezing cabin with your worst enemy, would you have swallowed your pride and shared that blanket fort, or would you have tried to tough it out alone? Let's get a conversation going down there. I read every single comment. If this story made you smile, gasp, or kick your feet, please do me a massive favor and hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow and tells me you want more stories exactly like this one. And if you haven't already, make sure to click subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Thank you so much for listening, for being here, and for supporting the channel. You are the best audience on YouTube. This is your GL girlfriend signing off. Stay warm, stay safe, and I will see you in the next story. Bye for now.